terms of stuff, deadlines are unchanged. So exam 1, quizzes part 2, deadline October 19th. Exam 2, quizzes part 3, November 16th. Then exam 3, exam 4, quizzes part 4, December 7th. And then for the paper, the same dates remain, so November 9th for drafts, November 14th for +5, and November 21st for merge deadline, and then December 8th, the day after the day that shall live in infamy, deadline for drafts.
My last time asking this. The draft, we give it to you, just print it out and give it to you? Okay.
Yeah, I also have a drop envelope, pickup envelope outside my office there.
Okay.
And then you can just, I check it every time I come to my office, but check it. And I can either, if I get it before class, I'll bring it to class. Or if it's just dropped off later, I'll put it in the pickup envelope.
Okay.
You can also specify on the draft, you write like leave an envelope or bring to class. Okay, before pressing on to the new stuff, anything about the stuff to be or the stuff that has been that needs more stuff? Oh, as far as Wednesday class, I don't know. I think last I checked, we're still open. And TCC and FSU have colluded with the storm.
They emailed it and they said it's closed.
It is? Oh.
So Tuesday from 12 to Friday.
I think I said no class Wednesday, no class Friday. And Saturday. Okay, so last time we're looking at our good dead friend Leibniz, talking about this is the best of all possible worlds. And of course another way to put that is there's no better world possible. Now we saw that in addition to his metaphysical reply about possible worlds, he also lays out one sort of standard stock reply of the big picture, and then kind of interesting variation, which is the world's not just for us. And so he used the analogy of like temperature, the fact that we all have to be like building like this means the temperature may not be perfect for me or perfect for you, but it's kind of the average that everyone can follow it. Then we saw that he denied pantheism, the view that everything is God, which is considered heresy at best. Now, what he has to do then, as we saw previously, he makes the argument that through sufficient reason that God is responsible, the cause of everything. And one implication of that is everything that occurs would be God's responsibility. Now for good things, like rainbows and kittens and waffles and stuff, and love, that's all great. But then the terrible stuff like genocide and other awful things, that all comes from God too. Now, if you go to the Old Testament God, there's no problem of evil, because God doesn't say he's good, he says all things come from him, so no problem there. But Leibniz has to respond to the challenge of evil. So how do you have God being all good, all powerful and knowing, but still allowing evil? Now this problem is an old problem. It even predates, even though it's a problem especially for Christianity, it predates, monotheism, actually not monotheism, but Christianity. Now the ancient thinkers, like our good
I was going to say, didn't he say like, being perfect only applies to God? And
yeah.
so the world was like, whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, one reason is as we saw, there can only be one perfect being, so logically there can only be an perfect world. That's part of his, a key part of his reply. Good, excellent point. Now, before the idea of monotheistic God being all good, all powerful, and knowing came out, the ancient thinkers like our good dead friends Aristotle and Plato had to deal with not a problem of evil for their gods, but basically a problem of imperfection. Why is the world not perfect? Because Plato believed, as we'll see in the future, these perfect forms. Aristotle also believed in forms, not in the Platonic heaven, but here, and they still have to explain why is stuff not perfect. Why isn't it super awesome? Now the ancients, Plato and Aristotle and others, had a kind of an easy way out. On Plato's creation story, what happened was is there's the world, which has always been. Similarly, Aristotle believed in an eternal world without beginning, world without end. So it was never created. And Aristotle believed in this stuff called prime matter, which sounds kind of cool, like something you get from Amazon. Trip to you, prime matter, how delicious. But what he meant by it is essentially prime matter is matter before anything's been done to it. Metaphorically, you could think of it like clay, if you want to use like an old metaphor, or if you want to be, all 21st century, you can think of it as that plastic spool that goes into a 3D printer, that's used as a raw material to print stuff. Now, Plato's view is the reason why the world is imperfect is because of that matter. It's resistant and chaotic and imperfect, so no matter how well you try to shape it or mold it, it's always going to be a little bit defective, a little bit imperfect. To use another metaphor, if you've ever been to like the beach and you're trying to make stuff like sandcastles, it's never going to work quite right because the sand's a very imperfect building material. Like you'll start drying out and collapsing, and no matter how good your sand toys are, it's still not going to work tragically perfectly. So they have an easy out. Matter pre-existed, it's always been here, it's kind of chaotic and resistant and imperfect, so no matter how you try to shape it, it's going to be not perfect. Now, to use an analogy, a metaphor, on that view, whoever is in charge of like shaping stuff has got an easy out. You can imagine an analogy to like a contractor hired to do building, and then someone else is contracted to provide material. If the material is not that great, and the person, the work crew assembling it, the person in charge says, hey look, they just bring me these trucks of this crappy stuff, and my team, they're doing the best they can with this crappy stuff. Look, they're working really well. And that could be, obviously totally true, because if you're in charge of just construction and people are bringing you crappy stuff, that's not on you. Now, it doesn't work for God, though, because in the case of God, he's not subcontracting the world to somebody else. He can't say, hey, I'm just trying to God here, I'm doing the best I can, this other idiot keeps bringing crappy material. Well, no, because the view is that God does everything. He doesn't have subcontractors. So he creates everything, and then so anything that's going to be bad, it's all him. He is, he's the main contractor. So why does Leibniz even mention the old dead gods, or the even older dead gods? Well, he thinks he can use this as a model to get out of the trouble. And I mentioned before the view that's called intellectualism. It's not being all pretentious and sipping, lattes while discussing, Proust and so forth. An intellectualist on this view is that God's power is limited by his intellect. So God can do anything that's possible, but he can't do the impossible. So instead of having crappy matter, that's, God's like, oh, this matter's so terrible, why am I stuck with this crappy stuff? Oh, that's right, I created it. What limits God now is not the matter, but logic.
So is that kind of like the same thing when he was saying about the best of possible world? So it's like he knew all the things and it was like, it's going to be some bad, but it's like the best option. Yeah, literally he's doing the best he can do. And the limit is the logic limit. So like the thing that you brought up about how you can't have two perfect beings, so God logically, he can't make the world perfect, because it's just like, kind of like metaphorically with Plato, you get this crappy stuff you're trying to mold. In this case, it's like God's trying to make everything as good as he can, but logic is just ruining everything, as it always does. Yeah, so his idea is that the eternal verities, the eternal truths, they cause the trouble. They create the imperfections and errors. So essentially it's logic that causes the trouble. One of the main problems is, again, he can't create a perfect world because a perfect entity would be him. He can't do that. So for the intellectualist, the problem evil can be solved. God can't do the impossible. A perfect world is impossible, so God can't do it. Now, somewhat ironically, people who are voluntarists, again, they're not people who like show up and say, I'm going to fill sandbags and help out in participation and so on. These are people who believe that God's will is supreme. He can will anything, even the impossible.
So for the voluntarists, God could will a perfect world. Not possible, but he could do it because he can do anything. So if a person's a voluntarist, they're really on the hook for the problem of evil, because God, this way, there's no option out in this manner. Now he draws, again, a metaphor, connection, or analogy to Plato. Plato's view, again, is that you got this imperfect matter, it's trying to be shaped by the forms, but it's just not that great. Again, going back to the beach metaphor, it's like having a really good, say, sandcastle mold. You're like putting the sand in it, you're like, it's still going to dry out and be kind of bad. So God is limited by his understanding and necessity. So he can only do what's possible. In a perfect world, it's not possible. So evil is going to appear. But he doesn't put it there. So what he does is he gets some use out of Aristotle's accounts of cause, like in terms of how God causes the world but doesn't cause the evil. And I'll use a cheese metaphor here, not involving Parmenides this time. Now, when you're making Swiss cheese, suppose you get like a Swiss cheese kit, from Prime Matter from Amazon. Do you get is there like a little bag of holes that you put in and stir in the holes to get the holes in Swiss cheese? No, you don't have to add the holes. It's not like, oh crap, I forgot to put the holes in the cheese. I just have a weird looking Swiss. No, the holes are part of the process. And so if the world is like Swiss cheese and it's got to have holes in it, God doesn't have to put the holes in. The holes are the evil. They just are part, they're just part of the process. They're where the cheese is not. And so the idea is that God doesn't cause the evil. He doesn't go and create a world and like, say, throw in some evil stuff. It's that when he creates it, the evil is a lack. It's missing pieces. So he's not responsible for that. So everything that's positive he creates. Everything that is evil is merely a lack.
Okay, so the whole thing would be like, God is the only one that's perfect. So when he created people, he can't create people that's perfect like him because
They'd be
it
him.
would be him. So their lack of knowledge is like the holes in the cheese.
Yeah, because they're like Swiss cheese, we're like Swiss cheese. He doesn't have to put like evil in us. By being imperfect, the evil is just kind of there. So when you make the Swiss cheese, the process puts holes in it, and just because of the way Swiss cheese works. In this case, the world has got to have, by its nature, it's got to have missing pieces. Yeah, so that's why we have our defects. He can't make us perfect. So he doesn't make us evil. He makes us as good as he can, but then we have missing pieces. Because like you said, if he made us perfect, we'd be him. We'd just be him, not us. So they hit on this notion that evil is a privation, a lack, an absence. So if you're making a list of the things in the world, evil is not actually there. It's not a thing that's here, it's a thing that's missing. To illustrate, think of like someone being short. Does a short person have a whole bunch of short, or do they just have a lack of tall, or lack of height? Like if you're describing someone, you say, man, that person's got a whole bunch of short, so much short going on. No, you'd say you might say someone's short, but you don't say they got a whole bunch of short. You'd say they lack height. So it's not that a short person has a lot of short, they just have a lack of height. So it's not like you wouldn't take like a tall person and add short to them to make them shorter. So the idea was these are deficiencies, they're absences. And so when God creates the world, he puts in all the positive stuff, and the evil stuff is just the missing pieces. So it's not on the list of ingredients. So if you look at like the list of ingredients in the world, shortness is not one of the ingredients, because shortness is not a thing, it's a lack of a thing. Or so they claimed. Yeah, so during the Middle Ages, that's where this notion, really got rolling, and Leibniz is just kind of borrowing that notion, that evil is not a positive thing, it's a lack of goodness. Now we now turn to Leibniz's famous analogy of the boat, in which I get to draw boats badly. So here's the setup. And of course it's an analogy, so it's comparing two things. And the idea is that if you accept the first thing, the boats, and you find it convincing, you'll accept what it's supposed to be an analogy for. And like with any analogy, like a horse trader analogy, it depends on those three factors: number of similarities, relevance of similarities, and any relevant dissimilarities that sink the boats. So this is what we got going on. We got a river, and it's got a current, as rivers do. And then in the river, there are boats. And imagine, even though they're badly drawn, that the boats are all the same, same design. But where they differ is the cargo they're carrying. And so some boats have heavier cargoes, some have lighter cargoes, more and less in them. And they're being pushed along by the current of the river. So they're kind of like during the American, before they invented outboard motors, flatboats were a common thing. If you ever seen like old Western movies, occasionally they'll show them. They're now known as barges. Barges don't have any motors in themselves or power themselves, they're just pulled by other things. And what people would do is get these flatboats and load them up with stuff, and they'd go down the river, just by the current. And then they'd pull them back up with probably like horses or donkeys, or later on get tugged by a steamboat. I know way too much about flatboats. Nothing to do with philosophy, but sharing knowledge. So you have these boats at different amounts of cargo being pushed by the stream. Now, if you have experience in boats or anything heavy, or we could use the metaphor, the analogy of cars. If you have identical cars, and there are trucks that are loaded with heavier stuff, then supposed to be a knot ring, but it's not stick. So you have if you have heavier trucks, which trucks and someone's pushing on the gas the same amount, which one is going to go slower?
Cars and trucks.
Yeah, or we could just use boats. Which of the boats is going to go back to the boat? So which boat would be slowest? Yeah, the heavy one, because it's got more stuff. Or if you use the analogy of trucks today, if you have 3 identical trucks, then the one with the most weight would end up going the slowest. You could also use the metaphor of of other things, like the metaphor of the cell phone in terms of being charged. So if you have a battery that's bad, it's going to get less charge. So the setup seems pretty reasonable. You got all these different boats, different weights in them, same current. The boat with the most weight in it's going to will be the slowest boat, take the longest to get going. Now, what then is going to come of this? Well, in explaining this part of it, what Leibniz does, and it may seem kind of odd, he doesn't say that the heavier boats resist more. So it's not that the heavy boat is resisting less. What he claims is this. He says the heavier boat gets less push. It receives less. So it's not resisting the current, it's getting less from the current. Which, if you think about it in terms of responsibility or blame, it's rather like he's saying the boat is to blame for the cargo is to blame for the boat being slow. So it's not the current has any responsibility, because it's doing all that it can do, it's pushing all boats equally. It's just the heavy weight doesn't receive it. So it's not resisting the current, it's just getting less from it. So all the blame is on the heavy weight. Now, at first it may seem kind of odd but harmless, but it's absolutely critical for his analogy. And here's how it goes. So this is the initial part. This is the thing that he's using as the X in the analogy. So he's got boats, the river, the current, the weight. And the idea being that the current is giving all the push it can do, but the boats with more weight, they're receiving less. They're not resisting the current, they're getting less from it. So they're to blame. So then here we go to the metaphor. And of course with any analogy, you're going to have a comparison, things being analogous to other things. So in this case, God is the river. And the push, the current, is God giving things all the good stuff. The boats are the things. So it would be, people, so each of us would be a boat, and all of the things, cats and dogs and so forth. So everything or person or critter in the universe would be a boat. And the cargo is made up of the creature's defects and limitations. So the more defective or limited the entity is, the being or thing, the more weight it's got. So why does this, according to Leibniz, help with the problem of evil? Well, the way he looks at it is this. God's not responsible for the slowness of the boats, because the slowness is like the evil. So the faster the boat's going, the better. The slower, the worse. Now God is giving, as the current, he's giving everything, every creature, every being, every person, equal push, equal goodness. So where do things go wrong? Well, this is what he claims. Each entity has got its own defects, the weight that it bears. And it doesn't resist God. Again, which is why it says, it's not the boats resisting the current, it's that they receive less. So God is doing all he can, and the creatures, entities that are more defective, they get less from God. So the blame is not on him. He's giving to all creatures equally. The blame is on the creature. It's getting less, and it's its fault, not God. He's off the hook. So he produces everything that is good and perfect, and everything that's imperfect comes from the creatures. So, roughly put, he's not to blame for evil. The boats are. We are to blame for it. Now, we can also use, if you want to use like a more modern analogy, you use the metaphor of the cell phones. Now, if you had a cell phone, or you use laptops, also use smartphones. If you had a smartphone for a while, what starts happening to your battery? The longer you get it. Yeah, it works less and less, holds less and less charge. Better than it used to be. Back when they just had the early batteries, like NiCad batteries, they would just completely die pretty quickly. And now with lithium ions do sometimes catch on fire and explode, but they do last longer. So I guess it's a trade of exploding and lasting, so good. Now, if suppose instead of the boats we have like cell phones, a bunch of cell phones, and you have like a charging station. Now the charging station is putting out equal power to all of them. And so the charging station is not to blame if a battery doesn't get much of a charge. It's all in the battery because it's defective. And so we're in this metaphor, the metaphor of the smartphones, we would be the smartphones and our defects would be the batteries. And so a really, really good smartphone would have a good battery and would receive more of what the charger has to give it. A defective and worn out battery would get less, far less, maybe even nothing, just not even able to hold a charge. So we don't blame the charger if it's, if you were testing it and saying, yep, it's giving full charge and the problems of the battery, we'd blame the phone, or rather, more particularly the battery. So Leibniz concludes, hey, it's not on God, it's on everything else. God's trying to do the best he can, but the world is letting him down. So in the case of people, why are people bad? Well, God's trying to make them as good as possible, but they get all those defects. They're just not receiving it. They're like the cell phone that won't charge. Now, so this way he thinks God gets off the hook. Now it does have does have some appeal, because, yeah, if you're going back to the smartphone analogy, if you get your charger and you're trying to charge your phone, your phone's just not charging, you'd wonder, like, okay, is it my phone? Which is the phone or the charger? You try the charger with a new phone, and it charges perfectly, you'd say, well, it's not the charger, it's doing fine. The evil is the phone, it's not getting that charge. So the phone is to blame. So if we look at like bad people who do bad stuff, we would say, hey, it's not God. God's trying to make them as good as he can, they're just not receiving it. So they're to blame. So this entails everything that is positive, good, and perfect comes from God. Everything that is defective comes from, well, us, because of our limitations. And God's not to blame. Now, one thing this would entail, of course, is every time you take like a test, every right answer is God's. Every wrong answer is ours. So God always gets 100. So I guess technically, we're all plagiarizing from God, because anything we get right is from Him. Now, this again does have considerable appeal. Again, if you were testing like a charger, you'd say, yeah, but if it charges everything, in different degrees, but good batteries get charged well, crappy batteries get a charge. The fault lies not in the charger but the batteries. So if God is trying to make us all good, and some people are bad, well, it's on them. However, there still remains a problem, because in the boat analogy, God is not just the river, He is also the person who loaded the boats, because God creates everything. So if a boat's got a lot of cargo, God can't say, hey, I'm not responsible for the slow boat. And if somebody points out, but you're the one that put all the cargo there. It'd be like, cargo master saying, I'm not responsible for your boat being overloaded. It's like, well, what do you do? I load boats. It's like, yeah, you kind of are. So if God creates all the boats, then He'd be accountable for their defects. So in terms of getting Him off the hook, that seems to not work so great. Which is why the problem of evil still is still around. Because if this worked perfectly, we just say, remember that old problem of evil when it was a problem? Not a problem anymore. And Leibniz, he wins a Nobel Prize in philosophy for solving it. Which would be a lie, because there are no Nobel Prizes in philosophy. It's true, every year I wait for the call. I do not get it. But it's not because I don't do great philosophy, it's because there is no prize. So that brings us to the end of our good dead friend Leibniz, who has died and is still dead today. Or if we're moving to our good dead friend David Hume, anything about Leibniz that needs more stuff. Yeah, apparently for the Nobel Prize they just like cold call you like in the morning, like at 4 a.m. The person who just won, one of the people who won one of the prizes in economics didn't answer his phone because he thought it was just spam, phone calls. Because most times you get a number, it's probably spam. And they just, I know they should. Phones. They just do an email. Well, then people think it was spam too. Congratulations, you've won a Nobel Prize. Just put your information here. They just show up with the prize and the money. Okay, David Hume. Born in 1711, died in 1776. No connection to the American Declaration of Independence. He wasn't killed there. He died of probably cancer or something. Went to Edinburgh University and was very ambitious. Like any ambitious young person this time in Europe, he went to the center of European culture and learning, which of course was France. He also, in addition to his ambition, in politics and stuff, his greatest ambition was to be a successful writer. And he did succeed, ultimately, because we still talk about him today, long after his death. He cranked out a lot of stuff. A treatise of human nature, an inquiry concerning human understanding, an inquiry concerning the principles of morals, the natural history of religion, dialogues concerning natural religion, and in his own time, probably his most successful work was a multi-volume set of the history of England. Now, his first book, as often happens, was a flop. It just didn't sell. But he used a clever marketing technique which is still imitated to this day, which is if you have a product that fails, and you put all that work into it, you just don't give up. what you do is you take it, repackage it, re-release it in the new packaging, and hope people buy it, which is what he did. He took his big fat book that just dropped dead off the press, created some other books from the material, resold it, and it was very successful. And of course, even his original fat failure is still, you know, you can go on Amazon and still buy it to this day. So, of course, he doesn't get any money from it because he's totally dead. Now, this is later used, you know, again, used throughout history, not only with, you know, obviously with books, but even with movies. The classic movie Home Alone was originally a failure. It was actually released, you know, twice. First time it was released was disaster, and they released it again to great success. It's all about repackaging and timing. So if you're in, you know, want to market anything, you don't let the failure, you know, take you down, because you can probably just take that stuff and repackage it as something and sell it elsewhere. He, of course, died in 1776 and is still dead today. You can visit his tomb, in fact, in Scotland. Last picture I saw of it is full of trash and debris, vandalized, so poor Hume. Now, Hume, putting him in philosophical context, he came after thinkers like our good dead friend Descartes and John Locke, and he fits nicely into the British empiricist camp. He's one of the big three British empiricists, Locke, Hume, and Berkeley. Now, he takes a skeptical view of religion. Now, he's often accused of being an atheist, but, of course, there's more options than just atheism and theism. A person who is a theist about a religion believes in that religion. A person who's an atheist about it is definitive. They believe there is no, well, in the case of God, there is no God. Someone who's a skeptic, though, sometimes called agnostic, they claim not to know either way. So if you ask them, does God exist? They say, don't know. If you ask them, does God not exist? They say, don't know. Now again, people often just take any people who are doubtful and kind of stick in the atheist box, but a skeptic doesn't say that there is definitely no God, they say we don't know. So it ends up being skeptical rather than an atheist. Although to people who believe, skeptics are often smushed in with atheists. Now, why is he a skeptic? Well, he claims, and he accepts, that there's only two broad ways to argue for God. A priori, by pure reason, and a posteriori, by empirical experience. And he claims that there's only these two ways to argue. They both fail, so there's no way to prove God. And this is what's called an argument by elimination. And there's two versions of it. One is kind of the Sherlock Holmes method of elimination. Sherlock Holmes had the view that once you eliminate, I mean, it's obviously a sensible method, once you eliminate all the, you know, people who couldn't do the crime, and you know, like, the criminal is in the group, once you eliminate all the people who couldn't commit the crime, the last person to remain has to be the criminal, a process of elimination. So if you know that there's definitely, like, when you're going, the criminal example, if you've got a group of 5 suspects, and you don't know which one did it, but you know one of them did, you know, there was like, occurred like on a train or something, then if you eliminate 4 of them with certainty, the 5th one has got to be guilty. Assuming, of course, that these are the only 5 possible suspects, and one of them is guilty. Now, there's also elimination to destruction. In this case, what's done is, you would say there's only these possibilities, none of them work, therefore this just can't work. So, in this case, Hume is using elimination to destruction. And he says, you know, there's only 2 ways you can argue, a priori, a posteriori, these can't work, there's no way you can do it, no arguments for God. Now, he doesn't then embrace atheism, because he thinks that not only can't you prove God, but the opposite holds true. You can't disprove God. All arguments against God also aren't decisive. They also fail in that regard. So it ends up being a skeptic that you can't know. Now in his work, Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, he's got three characters talking. And most philosophers try their hand at dialogues at one point or another, thanks to Plato. I think we all kind of secretly dream of like before Hollywood, writing like a play, successful play, and after they started doing movies, we dream of like someday having a screenplay, and succeeding. And so everyone tries their hands at a dialogue, and they're generally pretty terrible, to say the least. And mine was really extremely bad. Not only did I burn it, I buried it after I burned it because it was so bad. And the site is an EPA Superfund now. I apologize for that. Well, it cost like $1 to clean up, I think. So the character of Cleanthes, he argues for God, and he advances a posteriori arguments. Demea uses both faith and a priori. The character of, is Hume's mouthpiece, standing for Hume, is Philo, the skeptic. And he basically shows that all these arguments fail. Now again, just because an argument fails doesn't mean that it's the opposite, the conclusion is true. So if you have an argument for God and it doesn't work, it doesn't prove that God doesn't exist, it just shows that argument doesn't work. And so Hume doesn't conclude, aha, I've disproven God. He concludes none of the arguments work, so you can't know, or so he claims. Now in dialogues, philosophical dialogues, there'll typically be a character that expresses the view of the author. So if you're wondering, like, what is this person's position who's writing it, well, you just look at whichever character is winning. Essentially, that's their view. So what are his general arguments about this? Well, for Hume, he had the following view on the matter of truths. Now we saw, looking at our good dead friend Leibniz, he said there are truths, that are contingent, and there are also truths that are a priori analytic truths. And one of the ongoing battles in philosophy is over, what types of truths can you have? What can you know? Now Hume says one set of truths are what he calls matters of fact, and what Leibniz would call, these wouldn't be truths of reason, they'd be the other types of truths. So these would be things like, like the price of gas today, the size of the average weight of an ostrich, that this desk is here. So anything that would be about, facts, would be matters of facts. Now Hume considers this stuff to be a posteriori stuff. The only way you know whether a matter of fact is true is it's got to be an empirical, foundation for that. So if you wonder, like, what's the average weight of an ostrich, you'd have to, you couldn't just go and think about ostriches and get an answer. You'd have to go and weigh ostriches. Or if you wondered where your keys were, you couldn't just go and pure reason it. You'd have to have some empirical foundation. Now Hume claims that all matters of existence, whether something exists or doesn't, he claims is always going to be a matter of fact. So again, going back to my repetitive, silly example of the billigon, we know what a billigon is by definition. I just made it up, billion-sided figure. And so we know a priori that if there is a billigon, it's got a billion sides. So someone said, behold the billigon, and if they were telling the truth, we would know it had a dozen sides. It could be lying, but who's going to count to check that? But to know whether there is a billigon somewhere in the universe, you can't do that by pure reason. There could be, maybe someone built one, maybe there's a race that really likes billigons, they got a whole bunch of them. But I don't know. So that's a matter of, a posteriori, reason. We have to go and actually find one. So Hume says you can't prove anything a priori. One reason is he claims all matters of fact are a posteriori, existence is a matter of fact, and so they're a posteriori. You can't just think your way through it. Now, what about those ontological arguments? Where you have someone like Descartes or Leibniz or Anselm say, have my conception of God, then that proves that God must exist. Well, Leibniz says, if you can conceive of a being existing, he says, well, you can, kind of like Anil said, you can conceive of it not existing. You just, do that. He essentially is denying Anselm. Anselm says, no, you can't do it. You can't even deny the existence of God. You can't even think about it. And Hume says, hold my beers. I shall do so. And he didn't like beer. Fun fact about Hume. He did like to drink. Also had a really good sense of humor. Some of his writings, his letters and stuff are actually pretty hilarious, even by like modern standards. If he was around today, he'd probably be in like a late night talk show or something. Late night with David Hume. Or he'd be in the Supreme Court. Who knows? No, he couldn't be because he's British. No, wait, if he's American, he could be both. Talk show host, Supreme Court judge, survivor contestant. Now, what sort of things can you prove a priori? Well, Hume's term for the a priori truths are what he calls relations of ideas, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's how ideas relate. And he claims that kind of stuff is demonstrable, which is to say it's something you can prove. So relations of ideas would be, examples would be things like deductive arguments, math, and geometry. So he would say, yeah, you can conclusively know triangles have three sides. Because that's not a matter of fact. It doesn't tell you whether triangles exist or not. It just tells you about how the ideas work. So, for example, we know a priori that if there was a diamond bigger than Earth, then it would be bigger than the Earth. But we don't know if there's actually a diamond out there bigger than the Earth. Then we have to go and find one and look for it. So we can know relations of ideas. A triangle's got three sides. We can do like deductive proofs, because those are all just ideas, how they relate together, and sort of metaphorically speaking, those all just kind of stay in the mind. They never like latch on to reality. So the question would be, is there anything actually out there? Again, going back to my Billigon, we know a priori that Billigon means billion-sided figure, so we know what that means, but we don't know if there's anything like that out in the world. We have to go look. So Hume says, you're not going to be able to prove God a priori. Now that does still leave open, of course, if you can't do it a priori, what about a posteriori? Why, can you prove God's existence by looking at empirical evidence? And his answer there is no. Now, so he rejects the ontological arguments, because he says whatever you can think of, first he rejects because a priori reasoning doesn't prove stuff exists. So, but he also says if you thought it could, you can think of something existing, but also then think of it non-existent. So he says Anselm is wrong. So double up. Then he turns to the cosmological arguments. The idea being that there's got to be something that created the cosmos. Roughly put, those arguments are: if you didn't have God, you'd have nothing, because you can't get something from nothing. You got something, so there's got to be God. Now, Hume attacks this using his own account of causation. And super squished down, this is what Hume says. Being empiricist, Hume says, unless you can observe it with your senses, not real. And he says, so what happens when we try to look for necessary causal connections? And he says we never see them. So for example, imagine a kid, and it's the first time they see a game of pool, like ever. They're really young, and they're looking at a game of pool. And they see the cue hit the pool, one of the balls, and moves around. And they see it happen again, see it happen again. And eventually they start thinking, oh, there's a connection. That's how kids figure things out. But of course, you never see the causation. You just see one thing followed by another. I'm going to give you another example. Centuries ago, when I was an undergrad, I had an old TV with rabbit ears, and of course, if you ever dealt with like over the air antennas, it always gets kind of fuzzy. And the picture was kind of fuzzy, and I snapped my fingers, cleared up instantly. Wow, how did you do that? And like, powers. Now, would you see any like connection there? Well, no, I just snap fingers and it happens. Now, normally you think, well, that was just, yeah, coincidence. And then it got fuzzy again, cleared up. And then, second time, people might start thinking, maybe there's something there. But of course, the only difference is, it's happened twice. If I do it the third time, the fourth time, the fifth time, the only difference is it's happened more times. There's nothing, if someone walked in, at like the fifth time and was unaware of the previous five, they're like, no, I don't buy that. Because there's no difference. And what Hume says is, we never see any difference. It's just that if it happens enough, we just get conditioned to think it's going to happen again. And this was later presented more famously by our good dead friend Pavlov and his dog. And the idea was, Pavlov would, the story is he rings a bell and gives the dog some food, and the idea is eventually the dog expects the food. And so Hume makes this argument before Pavlov that we see something happen, and if it happens enough time, we never see the causal connection, but we just expect it to occur. So he claims that our view of causation is habituation. We think it's going to happen. Now, he then runs with that and says, well, so then how do we say that one thing caused another? Well, the only way we do this is if we've seen one thing followed by another enough times that we form the habit. Now, we use a usual analogy that people use for the cosmological argument is this. If we washed up on a seemingly deserted island and found a house, we wouldn't think that the wind and the waves, blew together all this stuff and assembled the house. It would look like a house. We would infer that a person made it. So when we look at the universe, we infer that there's a cause. Something must have created this. So it must be a creator. Now Hume says, well, we can't do that. And what he says is, we've never seen the universe created. So in the case of houses, we can say, yeah, there must be something that created the house because we see how that works. But we never observed the universe being created, so we cannot build an empirical argument based on causation because no one saw it, crudely put, no one saw it, the universe is being created.
What if nobody saw like the house being built in
Oh yeah, I mean that house, but we've seen other houses. Yeah, so his view is, we've never seen, we don't know how universes originate, he claims. Because we only got this one, so we can't form the constant conjunction, or so he claims. So next time, I guess since we'll be out 3 days, we'll just, because I know what they'll do last time we had a thing, they said, they sent around an email saying, send proof that you continue your classes by other means. So what we'll do for the rest of this stuff is, since I have pre-existing videos, is it'll be the virtual hurricane class. Okay. Unless we have no power, in which case, it'll be virtual but later. So, yeah, no.